Hi, I'm DJ Ware. On this episode of the Cyber Gizmo, I want to go back to the benchmarks that I did last week for Fedora and Ubuntu and take a look at some analysis that I did over the weekend and try to figure out what was going on. Because if you looked at the benchmarks, you probably noticed that Fedora's results were way off from what Ubuntu posted. So I wanted to find out why. I wanted to find out what was going on. And so that's the purpose of this video today. So after about a day of digging around, I noticed that Fedora's Workstation was using a different I/O scheduler for Btrfs that was using BFQ. So naturally, I decided to find out what Ubuntu's desktop was using and discovered it was using none for its I/O scheduler. So you probably don't even know what the hell you're talking about. But I'm going to explain that to you. Linux used to have two different categories of I/O schedulers. They had one that was a single queue. I had a group of them. There was a whole bunch of them that were in there. And then they had the multi-queue ones, which would be able to handle, and those became more popular as multiple CPUs showed up. So yeah, the single queue, of course, I mean, back in the old days when you only had one engine, one CPU to process, it didn't really matter how many queues you created because it was only going to work on one at a time anyway. But over time, the single queue I/O schedulers have been deprecated, and I think that happened somewhere around in Ubuntu's time frame, somewhere around 19.10. I'm not sure where when Fedora started deprecating the single queues, but they're pretty much all gone now. There are three multi-queue I/O schedulers that still exist. Now, yeah, none you can count. That's four. So yeah, you would be right. There are four. Why do we need all these different I/O schedulers? Well, as it turns out, not all I/O is equal. Some of it requires different parameters, different mechanisms, depending upon what kind of device it is. You're trying to maximize the performance of the system against the limitations of the storage device that you're talking to. So that was the reason for all the different I/O schedulers, was to try to smooth things out, make things run a little bit quicker. What does an I/O scheduler do? So every time your application requests a read or a write from disk, it goes through that request gets funneled by the I/O scheduler to multiple queues, and those queues are serviced by kernel threads. And each one of those kernel threads are kind of dispersed across your CPUs. So it tries to load balance the performance of the I/O reads and writes across your CPU, so that one CPU isn't doing all the I/O work for the rest of the system. So the I/O scheduler is really responsible for ordering the I/O requests submitted to a storage device in order to maximize the possible throughput from that device. So that's what it's trying to do. So each physical device that you have on your system can have a different I/O scheduler. So you might have one subsystem that uses BFQ. You might have another subsystem that uses none. Those are the ones you know about anyway. We're going to talk about the other two. Okay, so what do each of those do is really the question. So let's start with none. So none implements the first in, first out queue. So there is some code behind it, and it's very simple. All it does is it's just a simple, I get a request, I push it to the queue, and that's it. But it will merge those requests at the block layer of the device. So it will, in other words, it will look to see if there's a cache involved, and if there is, then it will look in the cache first to see if it has the data already there from a previous read. And if it does, then it's going to prefer to get that, since it doesn't have to go to the device again. So it's generally a good choice for NVMe devices. It's kind of a general rule on that one, since NVMe devices are real fast and you want to kind of, here's the I/O, go do it, I'm done, and let it go do its thing. MQ Deadline attempts to guarantee latency for requests from the point of where the request touches the schedule. So in other words, it's trying to make things, it doesn't care so much about throughput. It cares more about, I don't want this application waiting too long for something to happen. So the MQ deadline sorts the queued I/O requests into, it dumps buckets into reads over here and writes over here. So it kind of manages them that way. But it also sorts those two lists by the logical block address. So wait, why would you do that? Well, immediately you can kind of see that this might be something for rotational drives where you care about things like the block address because you want to be able to maximize where that head is sitting before you tell it to move, because that's the longest wait time, is when you wait for it to move and for that drive to come back around again. So yeah, that's why it does that. So the reads will take precedence over writes. Now, why would you do that? Well, as it turns out, reads have more of a likelihood to be blocked because there's a write in progress or something like that. The reads are more likely to be blocked than writes are. And so it's going to prefer to get those out of the way so that we don't have too much of that going on. So we don't have as many writes going on in blocking reads. So the MQ deadline also checks to see, however, how long a write has been sitting and starved of the CPU. So how long have I been just kind of holding this thing back? And once it reaches a certain, it's a configurable timer. Once it reaches that timer, then MQ deadline will say, okay, go, right? Just here you go. Just take all those writes and go do them in the next bet. So you might think, well, if this was in a synchronous write situation, that probably wouldn't be a real good choice. And you would be right. Sorry, no pun intended. But but this one is best for when writes are asynchronous. So you don't really care when they get done. It's just like, here, just go do it. I don't care. I'm done. The application says, as far as it knows, the write completed, and you're off to the races. Unless something down the road craters, and you have to go back and say, sorry, I told you it was good, but no, it wasn't. BFQ. So this one was designed for desktop and workstations. Why did you need one special for that? Well, if you have interactive tasks that are running, the worst thing that can happen to you is to have a stall while you're trying to move your mouse or you're bringing up a window. You don't want to have it go, waiting on an I/O to complete. So BFQ was designed to kind of get rid of that problem. And it's really more designed around latency, and it doesn't care too much about throughput. So it'll sacrifice throughput in order to maintain a certain amount of latency. So it tries to keep things quick as far as the latency is concerned, but it doesn't care so much about throughput. If you're at the other end of that, let's say that you're using an audio program or a video program. Let's take audio, since that seems to be the most critical, at least from a standpoint of latency is concerned. So let's say that I have an in-the-ear monitor, and I'm listening to the mix, and let's say I'm singing or I'm speaking. And no, I won't sing for you because they need all the. But let's say that, for example, that I'm speaking and I'm wanting to hear the monitor because maybe there's another person that's with me and I'm talking to them and I want to be able to hear them as well. But if there's a delay between when I speak and when I hear it, that's going to trip me up. And that delay, as it turns out, on average for most humans is about 7 milliseconds. Now, so there are people that are more sensitive than that can sense 3 milliseconds and even 4. But yeah, so you kind of have to play that by ear with them. Again, no pun. But you have to kind of play things based on the reaction of the person that's monitoring and listening. So you're trying to push that latency down so that when I'm speaking and I'm hearing, it's almost instantaneously, or at least it's instantaneously enough that it doesn't bother me when I'm speaking. So yeah, my sister ran into this problem a long time ago. She was on a steamboat and she wanted to play the Calliope. So she went up and she started playing, and she couldn't. And nothing happened until the steam built up, and then whoop, out it went. And so it threw her off, and she couldn't do it. She could not detach herself from hearing the calliope and playing it on the keyboard. She never got past that. So they didn't hire her as a result. But so anyway, BFQ summary tries to minimize latency latency over throughput. So that's its job. BFQ decides which IOs get access to the storage device based on a budget, and that budget is measured in the number of sectors to process. So once so it kind of accumulates things up, and then it's kind of bursty. So it's best for copying large files while preventing the applications from stalling out, waiting for those IOs to complete. It's a good choice for, like I said, audio and video applications. There are other applications that really work well with it as well. I'm not saying those are the only ones. It certainly isn't. Kyber is kind of a semi-intelligent I/O scheduler. What it attempts to do is achieve latency goals by evaluating the latencies of every I/O request that was submitted to the block device. And it kind of figures out, well, this block device is going to take this much time before the request actually reaches the drive. So it's latency, by the way, in terms of definitions, the definition that I learned. Now, if you're talking to marketing people, they'll try to change it on you, but basically latency is wait time. It is not response time, and it is not necessarily the time it takes on round trip. It is just the wait time to take something from point A to point B. That's it. It doesn't include processing time or nothing. It's just I'm trying to get it from here to here, and that's latency. That's the term that I learned. Now, marketing over time has twisted that, and because they don't want to show that they're bad at latency, so they redefine it to make themselves look good and make their product look good, even though it's not. But anyway, that's a lecture for a different day. So there, Kyber has two request queues. One's for asynchronous I/O, and the other one is for synchronous I/Os. And so it kind of keeps those in separate buckets. What is a Kyber good for? It's good for fast devices like NVMEs and SSDs, or other application storage devices that need low latency. So what makes it better than BFQ? Well, I mean, it's more intelligent than BFQ. It can figure out that this particular device has this latency. So it kind of, instead of some hard marker and counter, Kyber is able to adjust itself. So it's a little bit smarter. But Kyber also has a few downsides. And that is, because of that, you can see some wild swings in throughput. I mean, even in these benchmarks that I did this weekend, I saw swings on Kyber from 90,000 IOPS all the way up to 210 and then back down again. It was all over the place. It really bugs the benchmarking software because it can't figure out how many more times. It tries to run 3 runs, and then it looks at the results and tries to see how close they are. And if they're not very close, it'll call for another run to try to see if it can get something that is, a little closer to an average. And so it kept going until it hit its maximum, which is 15 runs. So, yeah, Kyber was kind of driving it nuts. Kyber also puts some strict limits on the number of requests that are sent to the queue. So at some point, it's going to go, I'm not going to send anything more to that queue until it empties out, and then it'll go over and start firing off more stuff on another CPU. If you get into a situation where you have high I/O events, it can really crater in a hurry. So which ones should you use? I pulled these from Red Hat. This is Red Hat's idea of what you should use. I'm going to do my own at the end, and I'll let you know what those are. So spinning Rust drives, Red Hat recommends using MQ Deadline or BFQ for those. And of course, that makes sense because you do have some sorting and ordering that's going on there. High performance SSDs, they recommend using none or Kyber for those. For desktop or workstation type or interactive applications, they recommend using BFQ. which is exactly what Fedora is doing. And for virtual guests, they recommend using MQ Deadline for those. The last thing I want to make you aware of is something called the law of minimums. And this affects a lot of different things, but it does have its impact on computer performance as well. And that is that when you're looking at computer performance overall as a system, as a computer system itself, and you're trying to maximize how fast that machine goes, you've got all these different things that are affecting it. And it's kind of like the law of minimums always shows this barrel that has unequal staves. That's the slats that make up the barrel, the roundness of the barrel. So each one of those has a limit on how much performance it can give. And so they represent that as the height of water in the barrel. The top of the barrel being that your system is fully utilized to the best that it can be, and it's performing at the best that it can be. And there's no limits in holding it back. So and it's just like I can't put any more water in that barrel unless I lengthen the stave where it's leaking out of, right? So it's the same thing. If I have something that's slowing down the system, whether that be a network or a disk drive or a disk channel, could be memory. It could be the cache might be exhausted. It could be the GPU isn't big enough to handle the workload that it's doing. Maybe it doesn't have enough internal memory to handle, let's say, 4K or 8K video, whatever it is that I'm working on. And then CPU, again, is the last choice because that's that is the fastest component in your machine. Now, CPUs and GPUs, you could they'll trade off at the level, because it depends on what I/O is going on at the time, which one of those two is more important overall to the top performance. But in most cases, those have the least impact on the performance overall of a system. They may have impact on a particular application, like a game, because if once you've loaded it all up into memory, you've already used up your wait time in waiting for things to run. Now it's all in memory and it's all in CPU and GPU. So it's just how long it takes to get stuff in and out between the CPU and memory, and also the GPU and its memory. Getting a system to perform well is a balance of all of those subsystems and your budget and how much money you have to spend. So yeah, you may run into budget limitations that just say, well, you're not going to be able to do what you want to do in order to maximize it. And then you just have to live with it. And you have to manage that performance of that particular machine to workloads that it's able to handle. Then it gets more tricky. Then it gets real tricky. So some final thoughts. So as you can guess, as you probably already know, that if I'm looking at synthetic benchmarks, I'm only looking at a specific part of the system, right? So like over the weekend, I'm just concentrating on I/O because that's where I saw this problem. But I'm not looking at the choices I'm making and how they're affecting other systems, other subsystems. Like, for example, certain I/O algorithms for the scheduler can have impact on how much CPU is needed, how much memory is needed. All of those things can come into play depending upon the choices that you make. So we don't always look at that. We're looking at the one subsystem, and so at some point you have to draw back and look at the whole overall thing to see what impact your choices are having. That's the warning I have for you, is that you have to look at it from a system view. You can't look at it, you can't be down in the weeds looking at networking or looking at storage and ignoring everything else. That's all I had for today. Let's go look at the benchmarks and let's see what I found out. And let's go look at it, and I'll walk you through. It's not going to be just a display. I'm going to walk you through of what I saw and kind of what my conclusions are. Okay, so what I want to do is go ahead and select I have 3 of these that I worked on. So that's the Ubuntu, this is the Fedora with Btrfs, and that one is the Fedora with XFS. So those are the 3 I want to compare. So let's go ahead and do that. Now, I want to show the wins and losses. Let's get these in here too. And yeah, we'll go ahead and normalize. And the ones I want to see are the ones that it was set to originally. So yeah, we want to see that one. We want to see Fedora Btrfs. I think that's it right there. That's the one. So we're gonna highlight that result, and then I'll highlight this result too. This will be all the defaults as I did them initially before I changed it, and then we'll compare them to the other three, the other ones. So okay, let's see what we got here. We'll refresh the result. And now these will all be relative because the differences between them are too great. So Phoronix automatically uses for both the number of IOs and the number of IOPS. They'll perform it. It'll be in relative performance. So just to let you know, it's not exactly like what I did, but the only way to reduce that would be to reduce the number of things that we're looking at. But okay, so this would be Ubuntu with the none IO scheduler. This is Ubuntu with the MQ deadline, and this is Ubuntu with Kyber and Ubuntu with BFQ. And you can see that it in this particular test it does really well. Then we have Fedora Btrfs. This was the original, the original run that I did last week. So this would be with BFQ set. This is with Kyber, and this is the MQ deadline. Yeah, this should be MQ, and then this one is none. So yeah, it did pick up. The Btrfs did pick up some speed, but of course not as much as XFS did. XFS really suffers when we are using MQ and Kyber. It just craters. And I can tell you that on the results, on Ubuntu and Btrfs and Fedora with XFS, Kyber went through all 15 trials. So it's trying to get results that are all clustered close together, and it can't, because whenever you're running Kyber, you can get such a wide range of scores, and that's what was happening. I was seeing from 90,000 up to 210,000 IOPS, and so it was confused. It didn't know where to put so it just kept running it until it hit the maximum, and then it came up with whatever it does for its average. So yeah, and this should be reads. This is random reads here. This should be sequential. This is random reads. So this would be the IOPS piece. Then we have random writes. This would be the number of IOs. This would be the number of IOPS here. And you can see that, clearly Ubuntu is doing really well. But XFS does pretty good in some of these. Down here, it does pretty well. Ubuntu is still got some performance on it, but it's closer. It's a lot closer than this is ever going to be. This is random writes, and of course, Btrfs is going to suffer there. And then, at least in my test, it always has. So this one is sequential reads, and XFS is going to be better than any of the others. It's a screamer when it gets to it, but it really excels down here in Kyber. A lot. So if I know that and of course we talked about that Kyber favors reads over writes, and so yeah, it's going to do better there. And then we have this is also sequential reads on this will probably be on the IOPS, and then we have the number of IOs here. 3.1, 3.129. So again, XFS does well as none here. So you can see that the I/O scheduler, particularly with the faster file systems, really matters which one you choose. But I can definitely get Fedora up to Ubuntu's performance levels. Yeah, I'm pretty happy with these, but certainly it is never going to get there with ButterFS. It's 3 times slower. And it doesn't matter which I/O scheduler I choose, and that's just the fact. When you get down here to like the medians, the harmonic mean, and you get to, Ubuntu is doing really well. There's no question about it. Ubuntu is fast. The geometric mean of all tests, and then we have the first place finishes. They kind of all scatter around a quadrant, where we get about 2 on each one, I think, 2 first places on each one. And then on the last place, it's ButterFS. And it's over 3/4 of the last place finishes it got. So, yeah, I mean, I can make it closer with XFS. So I wanted to thank you today for watching this video. And if you enjoyed it, please share it with your friends. And I hope to see you all in the next one. And bye for now.